Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar hosted by BFA Global and FSD Kenya. Presentations will take about 45 minutes, then we'll have a question and answer session at the end. If you'd like to ask any question, there's a question and answer tab at the bottom of your screen. Please note this webinar is being recorded and we'll share the presentation and recording after the webinar. I would like to invite our first presenter, Julie.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be with all of you today. I'm going to give an overview of our findings in the Financial Diaries follow-up calls around COVID-19 today, and then ask my colleagues Anne Gachoka and Cate Wanjala to share some experiences from the field, followed by some remarks from Tamara Cook at FSD Kenya about some of the implications. So what we've been doing since about the end of March is calling back many of our respondents from the Kenya Financial Diaries project. And what we've been hearing so far is that things were a bit hard even before COVID set in. So many people had experienced a decline in well-being from the last time that we talked to them in 2015. And mostly that was to do with demand contractions and health issues. And right now, with the virus-related economic conditions, things are going pretty bad. People didn't have the liquidity that they needed to get through a crisis, and we'll talk about a little bit about why. Many were already leveraged, and a lot of their coping mechanisms were just put under a lot of strain immediately because of the contractions related to the virus. For a lot of people in cities, going to their rural homes might have been a good option, but that was cut off pretty early on by the government, who was trying to contain the virus in areas where there was a lot of spread already in urban areas. We know that the urban impacts and the rural impacts are quite distinctive, and we're starting to see conditions deteriorating in rural areas. We've seen some urban areas see a little bit of a rebound of business activity, but overall things are still pretty bad. We think that a lot of the response activities should focus on direct cash transfers, but we also need to care about some health impacts, like the continuity of contraception and girls' education, and to ensure that ordinary people are engaged in key recovery sectors, because there's a long road ahead. So for those who are not so familiar with the original Financial Diaries study, it started in 2012. There were 298 households who finished the study, and we had been visiting them every 2 weeks for more than a year to collect all of their cash flow data. We again followed up with them in 2015. This sample largely reflects a lot of the demographics of Kenya, but it is a sample that is a little bit poorer than Kenya at large, and their livelihoods depend pretty heavily on domestic remittances, self-employment, and casual work. When the COVID crisis began, we knew that this would be a really good place to turn to try to get some unexpected insights, to really get a pulse for what was happening on the ground, because we have these long and deep relationships with people. We have a sort of historical context for each household, what was going on, what were their coping strategies, and we can see how that's impacted now. And that lets us do qualitative work with them rather than just survey data, and it helps us understand things maybe we didn't expect to see. So what we've done so far is to pull together a team of 5 interviewers. These are all interviewers who are on the past team, so most of them know the respondents that they're calling, and they have this backlog of qualitative information about each of them. In the first round, we spent a pretty long time with respondents, catching up on lots of things that had changed over time. So those calls were between about 35 to 90 minutes. And our second round is still in progress, started around June 3rd, and that's much shorter, so about 15 to 25 minutes. And we're planning to do 2 additional rounds like that and hopefully follow up in person when conditions permit. These are mostly qualitative interviews with a few structured questions that help us sort of track a few key variables over time. In the first round, we had about 200 participants. About 34% of them urban, which is similar to Kenya at large, which is about 40% urban. To give you a sense of what's happening in urban areas, let me introduce you to Leonita. She's 62 years old and she lives in a 1-room house here in Nairobi. Two of her daughters had very tumultuous relationships with their husbands and left them, and they're living there at the moment. And even before Corona, she was very eager to get them out on their own, but economic conditions hadn't really allowed them to save up for rent and deposits to feel like they could securely move out on their own. So the house is really packed right now, and when social distancing set in, that caused all kinds of tensions within the family. Leonida is HIV positive. At the moment, her care has not been interrupted, so she still has good access to her ARVs, and if she were to get sick, she thinks she could visit a healthcare facility without putting herself at risk. Her business is about selling porridge in the area, and her daughters sell chapati and tea, so these cooked food businesses. And this is really important because as soon as Corona set in, she saw that people were not going to work anymore, so they weren't eating food on the fly, and all of these businesses took a hit. So customer volumes dropped dramatically. There was also a curfew instituted in the evenings, and the big business in her area is a slaughterhouse, and they slaughter overnight. So all of these workers come in overnight, a lot of the trucks come in, and a lot of those people were customers. And all of that was put on hold until the slaughterhouse was able to work out a deal to work during curfew hours. Then on top of all of that, Ramadan started, and many of her customers were Muslim, and so she lost her Ramadan customers as well. So in that first month, really, of the COVID crisis, she saw her income about halved. And she didn't really have a lot of options because she was already in quite a bit of debt to her mother. And so she really didn't have very much savings. She really relied on the daily income coming in from her porridge business, which is normally pretty stable. She's saying that now things are starting to come back a little bit because of Ramadan being over, and she's just sort of scraping by now, hoping that things change soon. So as I mentioned, things started off a little bit rocky just because people weren't in a great position economically. When we look at the 2015 diaries, we see that a huge number of people were doing better off than they were in 2013. In the 2019 FinAccess study, we saw that Kenyans at large, a lot of them felt like things were actually getting worse. And that was coming out of a really hard time around demand contractions related to the 2017 presidential elections. And people really haven't fully recovered from that even today. Things had been getting better for people who were expanding their businesses primarily or adding new business lines onto their existing businesses. And things were getting worse a lot because of coping with chronic health conditions that were keeping people out of the labor force, because of demand contractions, so low customers, and a significant number from the disruption caused by macro level change in government policy. And that was really the opposite in 2015, where macro level changes were really lifting all boats, where, for example, there was a huge campaign to do electrification. That was a huge benefit for a lot of people. Instead, what we heard this time is that there's a separation between what development looks like at the macro level and what it means for ordinary people. So when this new train came into Mombasa, a lot of trucking was displaced, and that was a disaster for informal businesses around Mombasa. A big crackdown in illicit brewing really put the stamp down on a huge sector that has a lot of demand and where there's a lot of employment for low-income people. Different kinds of regulation have also come in very quickly and put a stop to many small-scale kinds of businesses doing things like carpentry, also anything tied to the distribution of plastics when a plastic ban came into effect and things like that. And we hear echoes of this sort of dislocation between development and ordinary people in the slum demolitions that happened here in Nairobi during COVID. There was an area called Korogosho where several of our respondents live, where a number of houses that were on government land, but had been on government land for many years, were demolished during the middle of the COVID crisis, and zero compensation given to those people who were living there, most of them tenants who didn't own the houses that they were staying in and who had been paying rent. So they were forced out to look for housing immediately, and our respondents talked about how much disruption this caused in the neighborhood. So one of our respondents lived in this area, and there happened to be sort of a half-built room next to his room, And the landlord agreed to take them in for pretty low rent of about 500 shillings, which is about $5 US. But they had to sort of build makeshift doors. He's very worried about how desperate these displaced people are and what that means for the security in the area. Others talked about the rapes they've been hearing about in the area because women are sleeping out on the streets right now. So we see that the disruption was really heavy in urban areas, especially early on. So on the graph on the left, you see there that when we asked people about how severe things were, we had a lot of 10s in urban areas. But when we look at how things are changing now, we see the darker colors on the right are the new round. So we're just showing here the respondents that we've already talked to, which is not all 200. We see that things are significantly worse in both areas. So the situation in rural areas is also deteriorating really quickly. So what does a 10 look like? It means like lost customers and lost jobs, although a lot of people are still working. Even though they're working, like 86% in round 2 are telling us that they're still able to work a little bit. They just aren't making very much money. So customers have really disappeared, working hours have shortened. People have new dependents in rural areas where urban relatives who used to be remitters are now at home looking for support to try to get through this difficult time. We see that small business capital and money for planting, money for school fees is getting diverted to consumption, and that it's getting very, very difficult to access any kind of liquidity. In the second round, we're starting to hear more and more about hunger. So people really not eating, skipping days at a time without eating. Cate is going to talk more about these differences in rural and urban areas. One big difference is the need to pay rent. So in rural areas, that's not such a big deal. But also we saw from the beginning an expectation in urban areas that there would be some kind of government relief. And that expectation wasn't really there in rural areas. And in the beginning, they weren't very concerned about that. But as I mentioned, things are now getting quite a lot worse. And we also know that in ordinary times, Kenyans keep very little sort of liquidity accessible. So they tend to have this set of secure income. They might work a little bit extra if a new need arises. They have just a little bit of liquid savings for small emergencies and a little bit of extra possible credit. But really where they get the most stretch in a crisis is from their social networks. So it's a bit unsurprising that things are so bad right now because everyone has been hit at the same time. Those social mechanisms for coping just aren't there right now. All of those tools that people use and they use so well in ordinary times with ordinary crises are really strained. And digital loans are not providing mass relief. We have a lot of digital credit now in Kenya, and some people are borrowing from those sources, but they're also unable to pay them back. And this sort of prolonged crisis makes it really difficult to make this kind of liquidity really work for them. We're seeing now these debts are really mounting from digital sources, but also from informal sources like credit at the shop, friends, family, things like that. And at the same time, prices continue to increase, especially for basic foodstuffs and transportation. Of course, men and women are also struggling with the crisis in different ways. About 20% of our families so far are saying that the main income earner in the family has shifted because someone has lost a job. And oftentimes it's women's incomes that are being able to continue because they were more concentrated in the informal sector. Women are also burdened by the reality that no matter what happens, at the end of the day, it's sort of their responsibility to make sure that the family is fed. At the same time, some families that had been separated over distance before, with husbands, for example, working in town and the wives staying at the rural farm, are seeing that they're spending more time together, that their husbands are seeing all the work that they used to do around the house and are chipping in new ways, even reconfiguring the norms of who's responsible for which household chores and activities. In addition to these, this big set of round one interviews, we've been calling a small set of people every week to try to just keep a sense of what's changing. And we've seen through those weekly calls that there has been some relaxing of social distancing, an uptick in business activity, but still very low capital availability, very little aid getting out. And we've seen sort of social repercussions emerging, more concerns over theft, more concerns over lynching thieves in the community, more strains on relationships that are coming from being unable to see each other for a very prolonged period due to movement restrictions here in Kenya. And in round two, we're seeing at a bigger scale just how difficult things are getting. So we've only done about 80 calls, but this data reflects about the first 60 calls that we've done so far in round two. And we've seen that the sort of feeling of the burden of the coronavirus has risen from about 5.7 out of 10 to an average of 8 across our sample. 81% say it's getting worse, 84% are still working, but their average weekly income is only around 500 shillings. That's about $5, it's not very much. About 40% of them had received some kind of aid, but sometimes that includes like very little, like a single bar of soap or a mask from the government. Well, people are really hoping to get food or cash. So we're seeing these instances of theft also arising and starting to see some burdens on the service infrastructure. Like in the beginning of the crisis, a lot of people were getting free water distribution, and that has stopped. Some of the healthcare facilities are now getting overwhelmed and turning people away. And we see that psychological stress is really mounting, even among some of our wealthiest respondents who are really feeling the pinch and saying, for the first time in my adult life, I'm not able to feed my family. I can't even imagine this. And I think Anne will tell us a little bit more about that. We're also hearing that with the aid that is getting out, there's a really strong feeling that it is not being distributed fairly. They're talking about the aid being distributed at night, being distributed only to the relatives and friends of these local leaders, the wazee wa mtaa, who are registering their own friends and family. Some are saying that they're only distributing aid to people who are originally from that area rather than migrants into the area. And that has a lot of tribal implications that are highly political. So this frustration and anger is really boiling up. And it's a really sad missed opportunity. In Kenya, we have both ubiquitous mobile money and algorithmic poverty scoring that could have much more fairly decided the distribution of cash and done it without the intervention of politics and anger. But that has not happened. We also see that debt pressure is really mounting, especially in urban areas. They haven't been paying rent, and they were able to negotiate that for some time, some leniency from the landlords. But after 3 months, the threat of eviction is becoming more real. Interestingly, on Mshwari, people also talk about being late. But unlike their other debts, those can't be negotiated at all. You talk to a robot, you talk to a phone, and you can't text back when Mshwari tells you that you need to repay your loan. To give you a sense of one respondent who's really going through difficult times, I wanted to talk a little bit about Jennifer. For those of you who've seen us talk before about the previous diaries, Jennifer was someone that we talked about as an example of needing to have these very diversified livelihoods and switching from one activity to another very often. Well, she's going through a really hard time right now. She's pregnant and due in October. The father of the child has disappeared and blocked her calls, so not helping her at all. She had been doing washing clothes for people in an area called Eastleigh, and Eastleigh was blocked. It had a sort of micro lockdown because of the government claimed that there was a large number of cases there. And while you can bribe to get inside, 50 shillings, she wasn't sure that if she paid the bribe, she'd actually be able to get work that day. And then if she did get work, she'd only get 150 shillings. If she paid for transport, then all that money would be gone. So she stopped going for a while. She's taken out as many debts as she can. She owes money on her rent. She has a huge amount of shop credit. She owes lots of friends and family. She has all these digital loans. She's maxed out everything, and there's really not much coming in. The only aid that she has received is a single bar of soap from a local NGO. So what does this mean for priority interventions? There could be quite a few, but in this stage, we're still in the emergency stage, and it looks like we're going to be there for some time. There's still a really strong need for mass cash transfers, and that will be true for some time, not just for relief, but also for local demand stimulus. It's going to be really important to connect people to recovering sectors, to help them replenish their assets, to get people back to school, especially girls, and to potentially provide some work opportunities as we start coming through this. In the long term, we have to be thinking a lot more about remarrying Kenya's GDP and Kenya's growth to ordinary people's well-being. That has separated in recent years, and we really need to think about strategies for getting poor people closer to the growth in Kenya. So I'm going to close there. We're continuing with the study, so there'll be more to read about. And if you're interested in reading more, and we'll put this on the website, here's a link to the blog series that we're doing on this study. And also, you can click on the book link there for a new book that's coming out on the old diary study in July. Let me hand it over to Anne.
Hello, everyone. My name is Anne Gachoka. I'm a qualitative researcher at BFA Global. So I'm just going to pick up from where Julie left, and I'm going to be talking more about the impact that are strongly gendered. So out of the conversations that we have been having with this respondent, what has come out clearly is like some of the impact are very gendered. So I'll speak first of all on the multiple roles that we have seen women play. So one of that role is income. And when we talk about income, I'll just tell you a short story about two couples. So I think the husband by the name Calvins is a casual worker, and he used to actually fed for his family. He would go to construction sites every morning, and at the end of the day, he would come back home with enough income to take care of his family. The wife, who is Joyce, from time to time, whenever she felt there was need for her to have her money, for example, to pay for, her rosters or askers, she would go and wash other people's, clean other people's clothes, but it was not very necessary pre-COVID. But when COVID happened, it meant that the husband was not able to continuously get the casual work that he used to get, because most of the people who are building, they had to put that on hold because they did not know, what will happen next. So it meant that that household was not going to have any income at all. So Joyce took it upon herself to continue and more, started looking for these jobs so that she could be able to fend for the family. So by the time we were speaking with them, actually, the husband was very grateful of, the type of job that the wife was doing, and he really appreciated it, which was something that he never did before. So the other role that we have seen also women play is, taking the lead in terms of decision making for their families. So for the women-headed household, most of the time, all the decisions were lying on them. So we did not see a huge change in that. But when it came to married people, so we saw that also changing. So women were the ones who were deciding, for example, what meals would be eaten and which meals would be skipped, just putting into consideration the amount of money that they had in the house. So we had instances whereby some women even opted to be able to change onto what they used to initially have. For example, for breakfast, most families were taking tea and bread, but that had to change because of the current situation. So they opted to have cassavas or even arrowroots, because it meant if they had small children, that they will be able, the type of breakfast will be able to hold, because the next meal they'll get was only during dinner time. So that has been reported in both rural and urban areas. So the next point that I'm going to talk about is the new role that we have seen men playing and the implication. So I'll speak about a couple who are based in Nairobi. So her name is Jedida, and her husband is a salesperson. So with this new situation, the husband could not be able to continue doing his work because of the government restriction. He could not be able to move in and out of Nairobi. Jedida is a retired teacher, but she had started doing consultancy work as a counselor. So they used to hire a person to come and help them in cooking and cleaning because most of the time they were not home and all their children are all grown-ups and they have their own homes. So that changed because again of the social distancing. So they could not allow the lady who used to come and help them to clean into their house. So the husband ended up taking a new chore of assisting, Jedida in terms of cleaning the house. So Jedida reported, she was very happy that their love has grown because they're able to spend a lot of time together. And also she was happy that the husband is, now doing more work and appreciating that it has been a hard work. So some of these roles, especially in Kenya, they are perceived to be women roles, like cooking and cleaning. So when men start doing some of these chores, like which were perceived initially as women roles, then, the women themselves were feeling happy about their husbands. The other thing that came out clearly is like so many women, again, both in urban areas and rural areas, they were able to, to attribute, the growth of their love. And also some of them, I think just to quote and quote, there's one that said, thanks to Corona, I'm able to spend more time with my husband. And again, I get to know where he is, unlike before. So there was also reported cases of faithfulness in their relationships, because some of their husbands, had, fidelity issues whereby they would spend a lot of time maybe going to their other mistresses, but that has changed over time and most women were appreciative of that. So I think the other thing on the flip side, when it comes to men, I just want to talk a little bit further about what Julie had already introduced. We saw the psychological impacts, especially for men who used to do very well before COVID-19. They were very comfortable, they had good jobs, they were able to provide for their families. So over time, even for those who had savings, the savings have already run out and the situation is becoming tougher for them. I'll speak about Peter, one of our respondents who is based in Nairobi. He's a tailor and he used to do very well and earn, a good amount of money because he had people coming in and out of Nairobi to buy clothes from him. He make like wedding dresses and all that. So when the situation changed, he started making cloth masks for some time. But when we continued making phone calls with him, he told us like the market is already now flooded with the cloth mask and he's not able to make as much as before. But because he's a man, he does feel like, like he has a lot of anger deep within him. He's very frustrated. He cannot be able to pay most of the accumulating debts, including house rent for where he lives and also the shop rent from where he is. So, like even from their own conversation, he was just like, like he's not happy at all deep within him. So their pride and their ego has been hurt in some way. And I think if the situation persists to be the way it is, maybe, they'll have built up frustration and anger, which eventually might not be very good for their family. I'll stop there for now and welcome my colleague Kate to take over. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Cate Wanjala, a consultant research assistant with BFA. I'm going to talk a little bit about the key features of rural impacts of COVID-19. We've been talking to many respondents in the rural areas. Some of them are farmers, some are small businesses owners, others are casual workers. We also have some who are salaried like teachers. So we have quite a variety of income coming in the rural areas. Some of the similarities that we've seen so far from the calls that we made in April, and even the weekly calls that we are making, and this round that we are doing for all the respondents in our sample, we realized like income has started going down. That is from the start when COVID-19 came in. And like casual workers, there are various effects. Like for casual workers who are doing construction sites, most of their work was stopped, like construction sites were completely stopped. And we have respondents in rural Eldoret who are saying like they always hire these casual workers, but they can only take 2 at a time, or so a casual worker ended up working maybe 2 times a week or 3 times a week, as they kept alternating so that all of them at least can have income. But that shows that their income had gone down greatly, including even that of the contractor, because now he cannot finish his work on time to move on to another job. And the other casual workers who are facing this problem are like those who are working on the farms. Like in Vihiga, we have very small farms that people would give out work to other people. And a lot of our respondents were complaining that since the children were at home, it meant that they were doing some of this work, which meant that for them, there was no work for them, hence no income for them. And it's not just working in the fields, but also women who relied on washing clothes and fetching water, like carrying water from the rivers, or making bricks. So they could no longer do these small jobs that earned them money because they're being taken over by children. And besides that, we also have those who worked in large-scale farming, like in the tea farmers in rural Eldoret. The tea pickers have been complaining so much because their income has gone down in such a way that factories have reduced their working time. And it means that the tea pickers cannot pick tea for a very long time and meet the threshold. Like they have to pick so many kilograms for them to make money, because they're paid like 8 shillings per kilogram. So before someone makes money enough for her to feed her family or pay rent, the workload has reduced, because even the farmers have decided to bring in more tea pickers, so they're sharing the work that was already there. And like some of them were complaining because we've seen other casual workers are getting some leniency from their tenants. Like they're saying you don't have to pay your rent now. For example, in Eldoret, one of our respondents was told by their landlord that they can pay in bits as long as they're paying something. But for the tea pickers, like one respondent, Florence, was complaining, I cannot fail to pay my rent because my landlord sees me going to work every day. So they have never stopped going to work, but their income has reduced by a very big margin. We also we have our respondents who relied on workers in the urban areas, casual workers in the urban areas, whose companies and big businesses were closed down and they were forced to go back home. So when they went back home, they became a burden to our respondents because they're their parents or they're their spouses. Like one respondent had her 2 sons come back home. The 2 sons were working in a factory that makes car tires. So the factory was closed and the 2 sons went back home, and one of them has a wife and a child. So it meant that their parent, who was relying on the resources received from them, was going to take care of them during this time of COVID-19. So when we're talking to them in April, it was a fear that they were facing because they had not experienced it yet. But since they saw these children are back home, it was a fear for them. It was a fear. How are they going to manage to feed these extra people that have joined the household? So yeah, we are going to follow up on that and see how it's going to unfold, because it's not just, it's a number of households who have people who have come back from the urban areas. And also, like when we look at the businesses in the rural areas, we have small businesses like barber shops, restaurants, and portion meals that are getting some income. When we were talking to them in April, some of them were still doing well, like shops that were selling maize, because a lot of people were stocking up on maize. But other businesses were complaining because of reduced traffic, like the government regulation where they're saying stay at home. If you don't have anything important to do, don't go outside. So at first people had taken that seriously and they were not walking around anymore. So like our respondents who had shops were complaining there's no customer traffic, there's no walk-ins, no one to buy sodas or mandazis just randomly to eat. So their income had somehow gone down on that level. And also like the open air markets, like that is countrywide, open air markets were closed, which had an impact to some of our respondents, because like we have a respondent who has a stall in Kapsabet where he sells cereals, but since he works with his wife, he goes out to open air markets while the wife remains in the stall. So since the open air markets were closed, he no longer went out in the open air markets. So he decided to go back to the village and try and just work on his farm as the wife kept the stall. And also, like, there's another respondent who had a whole acre of vegetable that he has planted, and he had ready market from vendors from Kisumu, but Kisumu open air market had been closed. So it meant that those customers were not coming to pick his vegetables anymore. And he was saying, like, even if the schools were opened, I would have approached some of the schools to buy from me, but now also the schools were closed. So it meant he had a whole acre of vegetables that he had nowhere to sell. So yeah, the government regulations somehow impacted on the businesses in so many levels, including the transport sector, like the boda operators and the matatu operators. We have some of our respondents who are in this line of work, and they, like, the curfew has affected them so much because most of their income is from 7 p.m. Those are the peak hours for the transport sectors in the rural areas. So like they were not able to meet, like for the matatu operators could not be able even to make money because most of the money they were making was what they were going to give to the matatu owner and not what they were going to, not for themselves. So like the regulations with the spacing, you not have to carry 2 people in a motorbike, make sure your clients wear masks, and some of them at that time in the beginning were not wearing masks. So an operator would ask, how would I buy my own mask and a mask for my rider, that is a motorbike operator? That brings the cost very high, and you cannot double the price to transport this person on a place that he knows it's usually charged this amount of money. Yeah, so the government regulations also has made it difficult for them to do business, and therefore impacted greatly on their income. Besides their stream of income, also we saw parents complaining about school fees, about children being at home, mostly because they had already paid school fees, which meant their food had already been paid for. They're supposed to be eating in school, but now the children are back home. They have to make sure that children have food, they have to eat, and also it's extra work on them to take care of their kids and to make sure that they are reading, or at least they're staying at home and not just roaming around in the village. So most of the respondents we are talking to, since it was first term, they had already paid school fees, and also being planting season around March, April, they had used most of their savings, most of their money to buy farm inputs. So they did not have much. So when you're asking them if they had stocked up on food, they were saying we don't have money to stock up on food. And in the rural areas, one of the things we saw, they had maize, which is one of the staple food that they eat. And so the maize is what has taken them so far, but it was not a lot that they still have it until now. So what we are observing now is that they don't have food in store as they did before. And so they had maize, but they didn't have money to buy these other food stuff that they would have needed. And also we have like what we are observing now from the calls that we are making now, the shop credit has really picked up. What we saw in April was that most people were not taking shop credit because maybe they did not have money to pay in time, so they actually just stopped taking shop credit. But what we are seeing right now with a few calls that we've made, Julie has already mentioned that we've already talked to about 60 respondents or so. So from what we are seeing is like shop credit is really picking up, and respondents, including the shopkeepers, are now opening up the shopkeepers are opening up to give credit to the clients, because at the end of the day, these are their customers. If they don't give them credit, then they'll also keep their goods. No one is going to buy from them because there's no money. So they have opened up into giving out shop credits to their customers. So what we are seeing now, like, just one major difference that I would like to highlight on the rural areas. We have the small farmers who have variety of crops in their farms, and we have the large scale farmers who have just a few, like maybe they're focusing on planting maize or focusing on just tea farming. So there's a difference in such a way that those who are small farmers at least have a variety of food. They can, if they don't have maize today, they can feed on bananas from their farm, sweet potatoes, or cassavas. Unlike those with large-scale farming, like those who have planted maize only. One of my respondents was saying, if I go right now to my neighbor who has a very huge land where he plants maize, I will not get anything because he sold most of his maize in the beginning of the year to pay for school fees and to buy farm inputs. So we are alike. And so this respondent is from Western Kenya, and he was like, but back home in Western, I know people have food, they cannot miss something to eat. So that is one of the differences that we see in the rural areas. But there's also the danger of people just consuming one kind of crop. One of the respondents we talked to, who is one of among those who are not doing so well, she had even slept hungry by the time I was calling her. She had slept hungry the previous night. Was like for the last 2 weeks they had been eating beans only, which they had harvested from their farm. So like despite them having variety, also it's not like all of them are ready at the same time. They just feed one product, and then if it finishes, then another one comes up. So it's still a challenge for them to just have a balanced meal or have a good meal on the table. So given time, I'm going to stop there and welcome my colleague from FSD, Tamara, to talk on the implications from FSD perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. I hope everybody on this call and those who will watch it later are as inspired, but also as heartbroken as I am listening to these stories. When FSD Kenya first supported the Financial Diaries, we wanted to find out how people use their money, what role finance played in the way they manage their money. And what we found was so much more than that. Yes, finance is important. Finance is an enabler, but there's so many other factors that influence life. And I had the privilege of accompanying some of the researchers like Kate during the updates. And I saw the magic of the relationship between the researchers and the households, and how they weren't just giving them the financial information, which is already a lot of trust to put in a researcher, but they were telling them the stories behind those numbers. And I think you've heard some of those stories today. When I looked at the registration list, there were leaders from the Kenyan government, from the financial sector, from the nonprofits, from donors, from a very diverse group, both within Kenya, but also outside. And so as we listen to these stories, they may move us. They may make us smile when we hear silver linings, like Judita's husband, who's now doing the washing up. But they need to move us to action. And so the question is, so what? At FSD Kenya, we've long worked on cash transfers as something that we think is incredibly important, and we'll continue to support. And obviously not enough of that is yet reaching the Kenya Financial Diaries households, which likely means it's not reaching a lot of other people. With businesses, they're depleting their assets. They're eating their assets, really. And so what can we do to reignite those businesses as this situation continues and in the next phase? So I don't want to say a lot except to ask all of you to be thinking, what can you personally do? What can your institutions be doing in response to the stories here? Right now, we're going to transition to some questions and answers for the researchers. And I'll moderate that a bit. If you haven't seen the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, you can type in your questions. And I'd like to throw the first question to you, Kate. How do you manage the human dimensions of what sound like they have been very difficult interviews? So as you're hearing some of these hard stories, how do you as a researcher handle that? These people you've known for a long time often.
Yeah, we are lucky. We have a very good relationship with these respondents. And I don't know, I think that is the advantage we are using, because now they are not even asking for anything. They don't even have a lot of questions when you call them. They just want to catch up. They're interested in sharing their experiences. Some are even telling us that they really want us to go back and see the development that they've had over the years since the last time we went. But I think generally we just explain to them what we are doing, the importance of the study and the reason why we are doing this. And they all seem to understand and give us the time.
Yeah, and I know you've also sent thank you gifts to all the respondents as well.
Yes.
And maybe the next one for you is from Viola, who's asking about the customers who have digital loans and are currently not in a position to repay them. What are some of the recommendations they gave to help the lenders accommodate them until they're able to repay? And then she also asks, for those who have kind of multiple debts, who do they rank in priority, and who would they pay first if they do get some cash?
All right, thank you for that question, Tamara. So number one, I think what we have had overall from most of our respondents who have digital loans, they normally get called by these digital lenders. So what they're able to say, sometimes they explain their situation whereby they're not able to earn, like income, because most of them are casual workers. So they will say, for some lenders, they're understanding, but for some other lenders who I don't want to name, they're very, stubborn in terms of like, they keep on calling and sending endless messages. As I think of yesterday when we were still making more calls, I think there's one of my respondents who actually told me he has saved all their numbers for the digital lenders who keep on calling them. So whenever they call, he doesn't pick up the calls. So that's one way they're doing. So I think to the next question about who would be the priority in terms of them repaying. So they have always been, spoke highly about lenders like M-Shwari, I think KCB, mostly I think the mobile banks based digital credit apps, rather than these other digital lenders. So we have heard about M-Shwari, KCB, M-Pesa, and it's because they also feel like they don't disturb them. Yeah, so they would prioritize it, they will pay to those ones if they have money, because they also believe they have a very good relationship with them. However much, sometimes it's a robot, but they feel as if they're talking to a real person, because some of them are really kind to them, even when they send the messages. Like I think some of them previously, even before COVID-19, they were telling us, you can imagine M-Shwari telling me, dear customer. So they feel appreciated. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Julie, there's a question from Peter about the different expectations between urban and rural households in receiving cash transfers. Could you answer that one?
Sure. And just to add on what Anne said, there was a change in legislation around credit bureau reporting at the beginning of the crisis. So very small loans and loans from digital lenders that are not banks are no longer eligible to report on the CRB. And so that means some credit is freezing up, but also everyone knows about it. And it seemed to me that when looking at the data, people are prioritizing those lenders that they think will lend to them again, but also being very patient, because there's some moral hazard involved in the threat of the CRB disappearing. In terms of the expectations of aid, no, the expectations haven't changed. The urban respondents remain that are not receiving aid, which is most of them. There's an exception in Mombasa where the county government has fairly effectively gotten food aid to quite a number of the urban respondents. But elsewhere, there's not very much getting out, and they are really angry because they did expect help. The rural areas, they're very frustrated, but they're not expecting a rescue. They're just hoping that things end fairly quickly and that they can sort of get back to normal.
Great. A question from Betty. Do you have any specific cases of people who have started to recover? What is the difference between their situations, and what can we do to encourage these? Any stories on that? I know it's early still for that, but.
Anne, do you want to talk about Joseph? I saw his story come in today.
Yeah, cool. So we have one respondent by the name of Joseph. So when we had the initial conversation with him, he was really doing badly off. Actually, I think he's one of the respondents who even told us if the worst comes to the worst, he will not hesitate to join the crime, like in order for him to be able to get some income for his family. So when I called him, that is like 2 days ago, what he told me, actually, he's so grateful because things have started opening up. He's able to get income from, he has a church, he owns a church. So the congregants have continuously, started now, giving him a little bit of money because they're able to go and get some casual work. And also some other businesses are opening up for the small traders who have businesses. So he's also looking into starting, a new business, but now he's saying at least he doesn't lack. He's able to get money and he can be able to survive. But he said one lesson that COVID-19 has taught him is not only to rely on one type of business, being the church. He used to have a real estate business before, but they had issues with his partners. So that was for some time not working very well. But now he's thinking in terms of even diversifying. He was talking about, like going into, like rural areas and buying vegetables in bulk and coming to sell to the small traders so that they can also sell to other people. So I think, yeah, he's very optimistic. And I think the fact that he's able to get a little bit of income, that is also giving him more energy and, for him to look forward to better days.
Great story. Beth is asking, have any of the people interviewed mentioned fraudsters as a problem in the current situation? Anne or Kate, maybe? Have you heard of any fraudsters of that? Or Julie?
Looking across the data, Anne and Kate are excellent phone callers, and I sort of am the aggregator. So correct me if I'm wrong, Anne and Kate, but I haven't seen any evidence of people worrying about fraudsters right now. But theft is definitely an issue that's on the rise. In the beginning, things were much more secure than usual with the security forces out enforcing distancing and curfew. That's sort of waned over time and people have become more desperate. So we're seeing theft of like minor things like foodstuffs and blankets, like very basic goods. And also an increase in hearing about sort of lynching anyone who's found doing that, but people are getting more desperate. So we're hearing more about that sort of petty crime than we are of fraudsters. Although one of our own researchers got a phone call today, a sort of financial scam that we've been talking about on our WhatsApp group. So it could be that our respondents are not reporting back on these issues, but that they might be out there.
So Kamonya is asking what the biggest worry for the future is if the situation persists. What are the biggest worries you're hearing? Maybe
Anne, can you talk about the urban areas and maybe Kate on the rural side?
So for the urban areas, because of the uncertainty, so I think, as we mentioned, there is frustration, there is anger, and then generally there is fear of unknown because they don't know what will happen. I think, like, for example, last Saturday, most people were expecting the president to be able to relax or ease a bit of the restrictions on movement because they live in informal settlements in Nairobi. So some of them always have a fallback plan of going back to the villages if things are not working out well for them. That has also been a very huge problem. They cannot be able to go back to their rural homes. So I think what I'm just hearing mostly, it's the kind of frustration because people are hungry. Initially, you could lack, like work when you go for your casual work, you'd lack money, but you'll go to your neighbor who would give you something small to feed your family. Then the next day you'll come and compensate or, like repay back. That is not happening because they are all at the same level. So a lot of frustration.
What I'm hearing from the rural areas, especially like the casual workers, are optimistic that once things settle down, they'll be able to get back to work. They even believe that the people from urban areas will come and construct homes back home because now they have seen if the worst come to the worst, home is best. So they'll go back and live at home. So they'll have work to do. But there's one fear of if the COVID-19 continues, what will happen? If the president decides to lift the lockdown and say now people can travel in the rural areas, their fear is that now the problem will persist and the population in the rural areas is predominantly the old age. So they're afraid that they're the ones who will suffer more if the restrictions are not put in place. So they're afraid of the future, of the COVID-19 future, but they're not so much afraid about their income. The only problem we had is for the small businesses that are now going down. They are saying that they will need capital. They'll need capital for them to get back to work. And some of these businesses, most of them that are not dealing with essential foodstuffs, like maybe say tailors or just selling things that are not food items, it is not a priority for people to buy those things now. So they know that they're either not going to have any stock left because they're selling one item at a time and consuming that money. So they'll need capital for them to go back to business. Yeah.
Great. Kate, maybe you could also address Radha's question on whether you've noticed any other social changes that may have longer term effects, such as change in funeral arrangements and maybe less pressure to spend a lot of money on funerals.
Okay, one thing we
heard anybody talking about the changes in funerals?
not really in funerals. Like, okay, there's someone who was saying like they really wanted to attend a funeral. Like, there have been several funerals that have been held, and people were being buried very early in the morning, like as early as 8. It's already done. So they're like, our life has changed so much. We cannot even attend a funeral. Like, it's a very big deal for them, and it's not just a big thing like a funeral. Even chamas, they like the tea that they are going to take when they meet. They like their mandazis. So it is really affecting their social life in a very huge way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great. Anne, what's something that surprised you? Some of this is what maybe you would expect. What surprised you, that Lauren asks?
So for me, I'll say the biggest surprise was especially on men. And some of these men are those men who kind of, like they used to think that, things can never change for them, like their ego. I think in terms of like, they knew like they have everything else, settled out. So when COVID happened and they have been, brought down to a certain level, they really feel they really feel bad about everything else. But I think that was a big surprise for me. Like people I would never imagine, probably they will be there appreciating, the hard work that their wives put, especially the married people. Yeah, so that was a big surprise for me.
Great. Julie, what are some of the key expense priorities for families now? Have you seen school fees, energy access, other things being deprioritized over food and health?
Food is definitely number one right now for everyone. And health is there, but people are mostly self-medicating unless it's a real emergency, and trying to avoid visiting health facilities as much as they can. But we are seeing some of them make sacrifices in other spaces. So we're seeing a lot of asset sales in this round, including several people who've sold a gas canister. Gas canister is like a sort of improved, it's a status symbol as well, but it's a major improvement in the way that people are cooking, and it's cleaner than burning charcoal and being over an open fire. So several people have sold their gas canisters for food as well. So we're really seeing like food is just number one. People are nervous about school fees, but it's very unclear when the students are going back. So it doesn't seem to come up very often as a pressure. Even the arrears that are outstanding are quite big for many families. And there doesn't seem to be much pressure about paying that off, or it's not really on people's minds right now. It's just survival right now.
So there are a lot more questions that we're not going to have time for because we've only got a couple minutes left. Maybe it would just be good to have each of the researchers give a last word. There's a lot of questions around credit. So if anybody wants to comment on what the role of credit is, and good and bad in this. Maybe Kate, start with you. Any last words?
Thank you. And thank you also to our listeners for having us over. And maybe one last thing on the role of credit, as you mentioned, I'm seeing like shop credit is becoming a big thing, because now respondents have no other income. Maybe they don't have any money coming in. There are those who depend on resources received. There's no resources received coming in. So the shopkeepers are helping people at least get from one day to another. And besides that, we also see people also borrowing money from M-Shwari, mobile lending, mobile money like M-Shwari and KCB M-Pesa, which is really coming in handy. Some of them are very old dates for those that we are asking, but for most of them, we have very recent credit that they've taken to see them through the COVID times. So yeah, the credit is really coming in handy in these times. Thank you.
Anne?
Thank you very much for all our participants. All I want to say is like, I think empathy has really, like worked out for us, especially the way we have been interacting with the respondents. Sometimes it's not about what gifts you can be able to give them, or sometimes it's not all about money, but sometimes they just want someone who can be able to listen in through what they are undergoing. And even sometimes, like some of them have been telling us, you are the only person who has called me throughout this time. So they feel good about it. And actually that's how we are able to collect such, insightful data. So I would also like to thank them. And for me, generally, just highlighting on some of the things like Kate has mentioned about the role of credit. I think we have seen overall, even before COVID-19, I think the digital lenders in a way have been helpful. They have tried, to narrow the gap whereby, initially people had a hard challenge going through formal financial services, a lot of bureaucracy in there, but now, with their phones in their houses, they're able to be able to access such credit. It has helped some of them in a very huge way. Thank you.
Julie?
Yeah, I think just building on what Kate was saying about the shopkeepers here, we have people that are right there. They know exactly what's changing for individuals and communities one day at a time. And that local knowledge is invaluable. They're banking on people's character and their own kindness right now. And that's a huge relief. It's something that digital will never be able to replace. The other thing on digital credit is that I agree with Anne. It's been really helpful for those who have been able to benefit from it so far, but it wasn't designed for a crisis that lasts 3 months. And unfortunately, we might be in this demand for some time. We've seen that in 2020, in the beginning of 2020, people were still recovering from the demand slump of the presidential elections 3 years before. So this is going to be a very difficult time where short-term credit products were not designed to endure, and where people would love to repay if they could. They do value it and they want to borrow again. So it's just not the right tool for this kind of crisis. And sadly, none of the tools that people have in their toolbox were quite built to withstand this kind of shock.
Great. I think we're at time. So thank you, researchers, for listening to the respondents so that we can listen to you and be inspired by these stories. But as I said before, what's next? What do we